All right, I'm David Burrow. I'm one of the residents in the psychiatry program here. I'm here to introduce Dr. Schacht, who will be our speaker today. He has a lot of material and has asked that I keep it brief. So with that, I would just want to mention he got his degree in clinical psychology, his doctorate in clinical psychology from Rutgers, went on to do a medical psychology internship and fellowship at Oregon Health and Sciences University, then did postdoctoral research at Vanderbilt in psychosocial treatments, and now is on faculty here with us, where he's very involved in resident education. With that, I'll turn the time over to him and let him get started.
So according to the book of Revelations, Armageddon is going to be the site of the gathering of armies for a battle during the end of times. It's variously interpreted as either a literal or a symbolic location. The term is also used in a generic sense to refer to any kind of end of the world scenario. What I'm going to talk with you about today is the end of the world scenario in families in which a child completely and irrationally rejects a relationship with a parent. It's a form of collateral damage that's commonly seen in high conflict divorce, but it can occur for other reasons as well. My particular involvement in this is partly from my professional practice and partly from being a member of a task force that some years ago prepared a proposal to the committee that was revising DSM-5 to have this condition included in DSM-5. The proposal was rejected, but there are still some things to think about. And if you want to know about this, you can't find it in DSM-5, so you can hear about it today. The obligatory, I have no financial conflict here. I'm going to start with some case illustrations just to give you a feel of what this kind of situation might look like. Here's one. Two educated professional parents approach a mental health professional asking for treatment intervention with their two sons and the father of the sons. The parents, it's a mother and a stepfather. They're talking about the relationship between two young boys and the biological father. The two boys, who are about 8 years old, have gone to a court. They have a lawyer, and they've asked the court to issue them a divorce from their father. When they're asked the grounds for this, they really can't articulate anything except that they are afraid of their father. The only specific example they can give of why they are afraid is that on one occasion when Dad had them on a weekend visitation, he drove across a state line without having called their mother to inform her that he was doing so, and this apparently violated some legal provision in the parenting plan that had been issued by the court. So you've got 8-year-old kids making this highly legalistic argument. The request was met with an offer of family therapy with the two boys and the father. This went on for months. The outcome was a miserable failure. No progress. Second case. Again, two educated parents, an elementary school age child. Mother is divorcing Dad because he had an affair with a woman at his workplace. In the course of the divorce, Mother raised a new allegation that Dad had sexually abused the child. The court, not having had time to investigate the allegation, granted Mother's request for a restriction on Dad's visitation. It all had to be supervised. And the court, assuming that Mother had the child's best interests in mind, let Mother pick the supervisor. So Mother hired a private detective. And at the first visit that was going to be supervised by the detective, she instructed the detective to take out his sidearm, display the firearm to the child. Can somebody get some stuff? Yeah. Display the firearm to the child and explain that this was to protect the child from father. Third case. And all these facts are in the public record, so there's no confidentiality issue here. Dr. Richard Lostrow was a physician on the faculty at the University of Texas Medical Branch. He was a specialist in pulmonology and emergency medicine. He had married a nurse who he had met in the course of his work. They had 2 children together, and their relationship didn't go well. Between 1997 and 2002, the police were called to the Lostrow home 20 times by the wife. Dr. Lostrow was never arrested, but on at least one occasion, his wife was arrested for assaulting him. During the divorce proceedings, there were repeated allegations by the wife that Dr. Lostrow had sexually abused the child. These were unfounded. During the divorce trial, the wife's own mother testified to her impression that she was simply trying to turn the children against their father. After the divorce, the conflict continued. Visitation was so contentious that Dad would pick the children up from a neighbor's house so he wouldn't have to deal with the wife. On one particular day in late August of 2004, Dr. Lostrow had to pick up the children at his wife's house instead of the neighbor's because the mother had kept the children home that day in order to take them to their psychologist and psychiatrist. The 10-year-old boy was on Prozac. He'd just recently been changed to a once-weekly 90-milligram dose. Dr. Lostrow drives up into the driveway of the home. The 2 boys enter the back of the car. The 10-year-old pulls out a gun and shoots Dad 5 times through the back of the seat. Mother, despite being a registered nurse, offers no aid to her dying ex-husband. And the explanation that the boy gave to juvenile authorities when he was arrested was, "I'm afraid of my dad. I'm afraid of visiting my dad." So, did I get farther ahead than I want to be? All right, my thing isn't working now. I'm sorry? Well, it's not wet. Top of the desk is wet, but this isn't. It's not wet. Yeah, I made a mess here. Will the mouse do it? Okay, so I need to back up. How do I do that? Arrow keys on the keyboard. All right, so why should we care about parent alienation? Well, in a nutshell, there are legal reasons and there are biological and psychological reasons. Legally, parents have rights and children have rights. We have an international convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, ironically, and for reasons that are beyond what we need to talk about today, the U.S. has not signed on to or has not ratified. And then it's really undisputed. It's a matter of simple observation that human beings are born completely incapable and could not survive without the long-term attention and relationship with a parent. You can have a condition which somebody in the literature called parentopenia, and I kind of liked it, so I've adopted it here. It's basically the deficiency of a relationship with a parent. And it's a pathogenic life circumstance. And you could argue that it can be a manifestation of mental disorder in its own right. It can result from factors within the child that interfere with a normal parent-child relationship, like an attachment disorder, or autism, or severe mental illness, say something that creates a delusion about the parent and the child. You can have factors within the parent that evoke this. Parents can turn children against each other. You can have relational factors, folie à deux. You can have peer influence. I'm aware of a young woman who I know socially who boasts about having destroyed her family relationships on purpose when she was a child. By telling stories about various other family members. It can also be iatrogenic. So when Child Protection Services takes children into custody, or when domestic relations litigation ensues and courts issue various orders that separate children from parents, or when clinicians, in well-meaning ways, think that contact between a child and a parent is harmful, any of those things can give rise to parentopenia. Now, the most extreme form of parentopenia is a parentectomy, okay? And parent alienation is kind of like a parentectomy. It's a partial or total rejection of a parent, manifest in an extreme, intractable, disproportionate denigration, rejection, and or refusal of contact with a parent. Okay? It's objectively unwarranted. Okay? And you can get potentially extreme complications such as that of Dr. Lostro, including suicide and or homicide or abduction. Now, not all resistance to parent relationship is parental alienation. The alternative would be what's called estrangement. This is where a child's rejection of a parent is justified. So if a parent has in fact actually abused a child and the child rejects contact with that parent, that's not parental alienation. It's simply estrangement. You can also have situations that parents might interpret as alienation that are really misunderstood normal developmental preferences. So, for example, developmental research shows that 12 to 18-month-old infants often show a relative preference for mothers over fathers. Children also normally may show a relative affinity for one parent over another based on shared gender, shared temperament, shared preference for certain kinds of activities, and so forth. When there is serious parental alienation, time does not heal this wound. It is harmful. Alienation imposes many dysfunctional lessons on children in numerous domains that can damage personality development and that can persist into adulthood. And I've divided them here, and I'm going to discuss them in these terms. There are moral harms, cognitive harms, emotional harms, interpersonal harms, harms in the domain of self and self-care, and adverse effects on mental health. And all of these harms provide a basis for the argument that was made to the DSM-5 task force that parental alienation ought to be considered as a mental disorder. Because if you recall, the fundamental omnibus definition of a mental disorder is it produces either dysfunction or distress. So what are we talking about here? Moral harms. Well, when a child is allowed to engage in alienated behavior towards a parent, or is encouraged to do so by the preferred parent, what's happening is that the child is really being permitted or encouraged to act in ways that are cruel, manipulative, and ungrateful. And that's simply wrong. We shouldn't be encouraging children to behave in that way. Okay. Children may be encouraged to take extreme actions. They may be encouraged to lie to lie about the rejected parent, or to spy on the rejected parent. So the preferred parent may send the child to the other parent's home wearing a secret recording device, or may instruct the child as to how to search the parent's computer for information that the parent wants, maybe about finances, maybe about something that could be used against the parent in court, so forth. Children may be explicitly coached to make false allegations, okay? And they may be given rationalizations for doing that. And then you may even get into situations like Dr. Lostro, where children do something violent and think that it's okay. Cognitive harms. Because the fundamental definition of alienation is a rejection of the parent that is irrational, alienated conduct involves a distortion of reality. Okay? We have children who are embracing irrational black and white thinking. They're denying ambivalence. They're finding superficial, unpersuasive rationales for taking extreme action. In order to maintain those beliefs, children have to suppress their own capacities for insight. Okay? Cognitive flexibility and maintaining these kinds of irrational beliefs are incompatible states of mind. And so children become or succumb to to a frozen parental narrative, and they engage in lots of primitive splitting. One parent becomes all good, the other one becomes all bad. There are emotional harms from alienation. Okay? Alienation is a lesson, a big lesson in being emotionally dishonest. Okay? Losing a parent is a big deal. If you look at the literature on the long-term effects of parental loss, it's a significant factor in future psychopathology, particularly depression. And yet, when a child who's involved in this kind of alienating dynamic rejects a parent, they do so under circumstances that do not allow them to either acknowledge the loss or to mourn it. Okay. Sustained alienation is also associated with a general reliance on relatively primitive defenses, because maintaining the alienation goes hand in hand with those primitive defenses. The normal process of maturation of defense mechanisms is challenged. And then there's also a constriction of the range of the child's emotional experience and expression, particularly when they're in the presence of the rejected parent. Interpersonal harms can include enmeshment with the preferred parent. Enmeshment is a state of symbiotic psychological bonding, cross-generational, between a parent and a child, in which the relationship boundaries become diffuse, and the child fails to develop true independence or true autonomy. Okay. In a severely enmeshed relationship, a child may have difficulty distinguishing between their own thoughts and feelings and those of the parent. And this is not the result of psychosis, it's the result of blurring in the messages that go back and forth in the relationship. In an extreme form, a very enmeshed child may become almost like a surrogate spouse to their opposite sex parent. I encountered one case in which an 8-year-old boy told me very confidently that his future ambition in life was to spend the rest of his life living with his mother, exactly as he was doing then. And he imagined that that was her wish as well. There are boundary issues that come up in terms of interpersonal harms. Children are taught very bad lessons about boundaries. The example I gave earlier about spying as a moral harm, that's also a boundary issue. Being sent wearing a secret recording device, and so forth. There is empathic impairment. The child is supported or encouraged in the activity of ignoring or denying the feelings of the rejected parent. Okay. I'll give you an example, again, from one of my cases. I'm sitting with a young child who is rejected their father. And in the course of the conversation, the father becomes tearful. The child pays no attention to this. I ask the child to comment on what he thinks his father might be feeling. And he says nothing. I invite him to look at his father's face. He won't. I tell him, well, you know, I'm looking at your dad's face, and I think it looks to me like he's crying. Could you look and see if I'm right? And the child looks at his father's face. At this point, he has to see the tears. Okay? But he says to me, it looks like he's crying, but he's not really. It's just fake. And he's faking it so he can impress you, so you'll say the right things to the court so I won't ever have to see him again. Okay. It's hard to imagine a greater deficit of empathy. There are narcissistic pathologies other than empathic deficits that also are created by parental alienation. These kids become entitled. They have lots of confusion about authority. They may become grandiose. Another example from a case I was involved in. A young child pulls out their finger, points it at the therapist, and says, "Shut up and listen to me. Your job is to tell the judge and my father what I want." I don't have to listen to you, and I don't have to answer your questions. Okay? And what I want is for you to tell my father that I don't have to follow his rules. That if I want to wear cowboy boots in the house, I can do it. It's pretty grandiose from a little kid who's otherwise not mentally ill. And then you can get harms in terms of what happens transgenerationally and in kinship relationships. Alienation often generalizes. Children don't only reject the parent, they reject everyone who is in a relationship with that parent. So they will reject the parent's own parents, the aunts and uncles and cousins from that side of the family, and so on. Now, there are also harms in the domain of self and self-care. Okay? These flow partly to some of the boundary issues in terms of the child adopting age-inappropriate roles with the preferred parent as a parental parent, a parental child, caretaker, a protector, or pseudo-spouse. To the extent that there was previously a good relationship with the rejected parent, now in order to sustain the rejection, the child has to reject anything that they've internalized from that relationship. So it becomes a self-rejection. Okay? And this can in turn underlie the dynamics of self-harm and self-injury. And then you also have problems with the therapeutic alliance when that is subverted by the alienation agenda. Rather than being able to engage in a treatment relationship for their own benefit, the child becomes preoccupied with the idea that the only reason to talk to a therapist is for that therapist to become your agent down the road in court and testify on your behalf to the court as to what it is you want. And if you don't give the kid what they want, they'll simply move on to another clinician. Mental health harms also result from parental alienation. You have a child who develops without the support and benefits of a two-adult parenting system. And there's a huge literature on the risks to mental health associated with growing up in a single-parent household. Children in alienated situations are also often subjected to the burden of ongoing adult conflict. The mere fact that the parents are divorced doesn't mean they stop fighting or that they stop exposing the child to the fighting. We have a few follow-up studies now of adults who are alienated as children, and what they find is long-term increased risk in multiple domains. Problems with trust, problems with intimacy, problems with commitment in their own relationships, increased vulnerability to substance abuse, increased risk for early and or promiscuous sexual activity, disciplinary problems and other problems with authority, and then mood and anxiety difficulties. Now, given all these kinds of harms, it should not be surprising that there is a substantial literature on parental alienation. Looking at databases available here at ETSU and just seeing how many entries there are if you do a search on the phrase parental alienation, you get hundreds. It's also in international literature. This is primarily US. The proposal that was made to the DSM-5 task force cited literature from 28 different countries. Notwithstanding the literature and the evidence of harm, parental alienation has no specific diagnostic home. We end up talking about it in terms of other categories. So in terms of the DSM, we talk about reactive attachment, separation anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder, shared delusional disorder, or a parent-child relational problem, which is a V code. Or in the ICD system, we have some other categories, but nothing specifically for parental alienation. Part of why the proposal to include parental alienation in the DSM-5 failed is because of ongoing controversy about the language and about a related concept promoted by a now deceased child psychiatrist named Richard Gardner. Gardner talked about not just the phenomenon of parental alienation, but he talked about parental alienation syndrome. And Gardner's use of that term became very controversial because of its application in court cases in which he participated. Gardner was an expert in many, many child custody matters in which parental alienation was a factor. Most of the time, he was called because there had been an allegation of sexual abuse as part of the alienating dynamic. Gardner's work came to focus very heavily on refuting allegations of sexual abuse. Essentially, what he said was, parental alienation syndrome is something that arises in connection with false allegations of sexual abuse. Therefore, if you have an allegation of sexual abuse in a divorce and the child is alienated, the allegation of abuse itself is likely false. It's that last step that made the controversy. The argument that abuse allegations were false because they occurred in the context of alienation. That's simply not a defensible proposition. But Gardner trotted it out repeatedly in court. And it infuriated people who were advocates for children who are victims of abuse. Gardner made the situation worse by some of his own other writings that seemed to be sympathetic to pedophilia. So he wrote some things that suggested evolutionary arguments for why pedophilia would exist and why perhaps it was natural and so forth. Setting aside that controversy, which has made work in this area very difficult, Gardner's description of parental alienation as a description is a pretty good one. The syndrome, stripped of the implication that it says anything about the accuracy of sexual abuse allegations, contains 8 criteria. Gardner argued that the more of these criteria that were present in a given case, and the more pervasively each criterion was present, the more severe was the syndrome. So the first criterion was a campaign of denigration by the child. Not simply making statements when they're asked about the parent, but literally campaigning against the parent. Okay? It's a form of domestic psychological warfare. Okay? When this is promoted by the preferred parent, that parent might be saying things to the child like, your father abandoned us, as opposed to abandoned me. Your father doesn't give us enough money to buy you the toys you want. Your mother's an alcoholic. Your mother doesn't love us or doesn't love you. If she did, she wouldn't have left. I'm the one who really loves you, not him. What's he done for you that's so great? And so on. Okay? Now, those are very overt examples of denigration. You can also have more subtle examples. A parent could say, there are things I could say about your mother, but I'm not that kind of person. Or, you're going to visit your dad this weekend. I want you to call me as soon as you get there because I need to know that you're okay. And if you get scared, you can call me right away. I'll come and get you if you want to come home. I was involved in one case where a parent gave a cell phone to an 18-month-old child so that the child could summon the parent when they were visiting the other parent. Guilt induction. How can you go see your mother when you know I'm sick? Okay. Other forms of denigration include even more subtle environmental manipulations, like removing from the home all photographs or other objects that might remind the child of the other parent, not permitting the child to bring into the home any gifts or objects that were given from the other parent, and so forth. The second criterion is weak or vague or disproportionate rationalizations, or that are frivolous or absurd. Here's one that Gardner wrote about, and I'm just going to quote it. It's in the form of a conversation between Dr. Gardner and the patient. Gardner to the patient, I'm very sorry to hear that your grandfather died. And the child says, you know, he didn't just die, my father murdered him. And Gardner says, your father murdered your grandfather, his own father? And the child says, yes, I know he did it. And Dr. Gardner says, I thought he was in the hospital. He was 85 years old and he was dying of old age. And the child says, yeah, that's what my father says. Gardner to the child, well, what do you say? The child says, I say he murdered him. How did he do that? He sneaked into the hospital at night, and he did it while no one was looking, while the nurses and doctors were asleep. How do you know that? Well, I just know it. Did anyone tell you such a thing? No, but I just know it. And then Dr. Gardner turns to the child's mother, who's been sitting present during the whole conversation, and says, well, Mom, what do you think about this issue? And Mom says, in the child's presence, well, I don't really think that he did it, but I wouldn't put it past him. Okay. Tacitly supporting the child's belief. Okay. There is a lack of guilt for the cruelty or exploitation of the father. Indeed, there's an inability on the child's part to perceive that what they are doing is cruel. Okay. Excuse me. There is a lack of ambivalence. Most people are ambivalent about a lot of things, but children who are alienated are not ambivalent about this. They are absolutely certain. If they're confronted with some evidence to the contrary, they will find a way to deny it or minimize it. Gardner talked about something he called the independent thinker phenomenon, which referred to the myth that arises in the families of alienated children that is held both by the children and by the parent, that the child's rejection of the parent is entirely their own idea. Okay? And here's another example of a conversation from Gardner's writings about how this can happen. This is a conversation between mother and a child. Mother, now Billy, I want you to tell me the truth. Do you really want to see your father? Billy remains silent. Mother repeats the question, louder. Billy, can you tell me the truth? What is the truth? Billy remains silent. Mother gets even louder. You don't have to be afraid of me, Billy. All I want you to do is tell me the truth. Do you or do you not want to see your father? Now, you don't have to be afraid to say you don't want to see your father. Do tell me now, what's the truth? What do you really want? You can say it. And Billy finally surrenders and says, I don't want to see my father. Mother then turns to Dr. Gardner and says, you see, doctor, it's like I said. He really doesn't want to see his father, and that's his own opinion. I haven't talked him into it. And then Mother turns to Billy again and says, isn't that right, Billy? Isn't that your own opinion? And Billy says, dutifully, yes, that's my own opinion. Okay. The sixth criterion is what Gardner called reflexive support of the preferred parent. This is a kind of automatic love. The preferred parent can simply do no wrong. The child will accept as 100% accurate and valid anything that the preferred parent says about the rejected parent, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. The phenomenon of borrowed scenarios refers to the situation when a child's complaint has a rehearsed quality, or when it involves vocabulary that's unnatural for a child of that developmental level, or when it involves language that directly mirrors or echoes the complaints made by the preferred parent against their ex-spouse. So, for example, imagine a 5-year-old girl saying to her therapist, Daddy's new girlfriend is a whore. That's not 5-year-old vocabulary. She got that somewhere. Or a 4-year-old who hangs up the phone on her father saying, stop stalking us. Again, stalking is not 4-year-old vocabulary. She had to get that from somewhere. Or a 6-year-old saying that she doesn't want to see her mom because she lacks discipline and cheated on Dad. Or an 8-year-old saying, I don't want to see my father because he keeps harassing my family with frivolous lawsuits. Again, frivolous lawsuits is not 8-year-old vocabulary. And then finally, there's the generalization of the animosity to the extended family. The friend of my enemy is also my enemy. Now, these are some quotes from Gardner about his beliefs that contributed to why his syndrome became so controversial. This is part of his rationale that unfortunately linked parental alienation to the refutation of allegations of sexual abuse. Gardner's error, in a nutshell, was that alienation itself is not per se probative of what caused the alienation. there's a differential diagnosis that has to go into that determination. Okay. Gardner's insight, however, was that divorce is a powerful potentiator of alienation. Okay. And Bernay, child psychiatrist at Vanderbilt, who spearheaded the DSM-5 effort, among other things, has cited research showing that a quarter of children involved in custody disputes show some kind of alienation dynamics, maybe not full syndrome, but that you can also find a similar prevalence in a community sample of adults. So what do you do with parental alienation? Well, family therapy, not individual therapy, may be helpful in mild to moderate cases, especially with young children. Individual treatment for parents may be helpful, but it's not a substitute for family therapy. And when the alienation is severe and entrenched or consolidated, then management by a court is a required element of the treatment plan. You need to have the court as your right hand because you're not going to have the ordinary basis for a therapeutic alliance. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about what that might look like, just to illustrate. Picture a situation. Well, let me talk about the court's options. Okay. One would be to simply give in to the child's demands, concluding that the situation is unfortunate but irreversible. So you accept the situation as is. You give full custody to the preferred parent. You have no scheduled contacts or visitation with the other parent. You essentially terminate their access to the child. And you have no court-ordered intervention of any kind. Second option for a court is to attempt some kind of remediation. This can be done through mediation, counseling, or parenting coordination, which is an intervention that involves having a social worker available 24/7 who can act as an arbitrator in parenting disputes in lieu of the court. Third option is to disrupt the alienating dynamic by taking the child out of the family entirely, sending them to boarding school or some other place to live, some third-party location. That can help the child if they are subjected to constant conflict in the family, but it doesn't stop the alienating dynamic because these dynamics can be promoted long distance. Parents can do it with telephone calls, text messages, emails, so forth. The final option is analogous in some respects to immersion or implosion therapy. What the court does is they take the child away from the preferred parent and they place the child full-time with the rejected parent on a contingency basis that says to the child, you shall have no contact with your preferred parent until you improve the relationship with this person you have been rejecting. There's a temporary suspension of all decision-making authority and all contact by the preferred parent and their family. And then there's a graduated, scheduled resumption of contact with the preferred parent, contingent on meeting very specific court-mandated milestones in the relationship with the rejected parent. There are some specialized clinics around the country that offer programs to kind of jumpstart this. So they will take the child and the rejected parent and put them together in a resort setting with full-time, all-day access to some clinicians who help them get past the initial reunion. Okay? And then they get follow-up after that. I guarantee you that intervention is not cheap. I don't know what it costs. I've never had occasion to refer a family to it. I'll be glad to take questions. Yes, Jonathan.
I tend to feel with very sick families, drug addicted. How do you deal with how do you address the alienation of a child from his mother who perhaps is a thief, or
What?
whose father is a thief and has stolen the Xbox and used it for escape?
Well, that goes back to the original.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I can. The question was, Jonathan was pointing out that he deals with some very dysfunctional families in the context of the focus of his work around substance abuse, because, as I'm sure we all know, substance abusers will do some reprehensible things in the service of maintaining their habits, like stealing their children's Xbox and taking it to the pawn shop and so forth. Or selling, there was a case locally here where two parents were in federal court charged with selling their children into prostitution in order to get money for methamphetamine and synthetic marijuana. So the question is, how do you deal with that? The first answer is that that's not what I'm talking about today. That's not parental alienation. That's estrangement. Okay? That's the distinction I made at the beginning of the talk between alienation, which is irrational, and estrangement, which has a basis in reality. Here you've got a child who has really been hurt and has a rational basis for rejecting that parent, and that's a whole different issue. Oh, here and then there. Yes?
If a child was to commit, say, a homicide, like the 10-year-old that you brought up, and there's been proof in therapy sessions or whatnot where they have expressed that they do fear the rejected parent because it was planted in their head by the preferred parent, would that be taken into court, like, as a, I guess, a diffusion of blame, since the child was basically brainwashed to think that the rejected parent was a harm to them?
Right. There are two ways that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, understood. Maybe we should be. Well, all right. I'll just repeat the question. Thank you for reminding me, Norman. The question was, if there were a situation where a child committed a homicide of a parent under the false belief that the parent was a threat to the child, what role would that play in the criminal court proceedings? Is that basically your question? Right. The answer is that mental health evidence in general can play one of two roles in a criminal court proceeding. One is it can provide an actual legal defense to the charges. So in this case, it would have to be something that would persuade the court that the child was insane, which means that the child didn't understand the nature or quality of their act, or that they didn't know that what they were doing was wrong. The other way that mental health evidence could be relevant to a criminal proceeding would be after the child was convicted of the crime as a mitigating factor in the sentencing proceedings, affecting how the court would decide what to do. Okay? So evidence of parent alienation could certainly be a mitigating factor. There is a single law review article on the question of whether parental alienation could support an insanity defense per se. Most of the time when you see an insanity defense succeeding, it involves a psychotic illness. And the reason for that is that the standard for the insanity defense is so stringent. You have to literally be so ill that you don't know the nature of what you're doing, or you're incapable of knowing that it was wrong. That's an extremely hard standard to meet. And so I've never seen a case where parental alienation succeeded as an insanity defense, but it's certainly been offered as mitigation in many cases. You had a question? There are two ways to address that question. One is speculation, the other is data. The speculative answer, oh my God, the kid will commit suicide, this terrible thing will happen, is the one that's actually offered most of the time by the preferred parent in opposition to the court order. Okay. The data answer comes from a handful of people who've actually had enough of these cases to collect systematic outcome data. Dr. Richard Warshak, W-A-R-S-H-A-K, has probably got the largest such series of cases, about 190 of them. And according to his data, the predictions of doom simply don't happen. And that a significant number of times, the child immediately experiences a tremendous sense of relief because they're able to step away from the sham and the false self and all the theater that has gone along with the alienation, and they're finally able to simply embrace the parent who they've been rejecting in the context of this gross family dysfunction. So while the concern you raise is a theoretical possibility, the data don't bear it out as a serious concern. Having said that, I would hesitate if, in addition to the alienation, I saw evidence of some other coexisting mental disorder that told me the child was at additional risk. Okay. So you'd have to take that into account.
What was the outcome of the case presented in the child and maybe the mom? Would there be even a road if mom, presumably that would be done, maybe not.
The child was convicted. He was sentenced to a juvenile institution, and just this year an appeal was granted arguing that his original trial was flawed, so he might get a new trial.
Would the mother have any role in this, especially if she might become responsibility for the child thinking this way?
Right. The question is whether in that first case that I presented where the 10-year-old boy killed his physician father, would the mother have, when you say a role, do you mean a clinical role, a legal role? To my knowledge, mother was not prosecuted. I think according to, I would want to ask a criminal defense lawyer to be sure about what I'm going to say, but I think that in order to be found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder or to be an accessory to it, mother would have had to have known that the child was going to do this and to have done something to help him with that or to encourage him. If she actually gave him the gun to do it, if she talked to him about it in an approving way and said, Dad's going to come here, you could do it, and that sort of thing. To my knowledge, based on what I've been able to read about the case, none of those things were alleged. They were probably investigated, but I didn't see it being written about. Yes?
When you talk about child, when you use the term child, thinking in terms of treatment intervention and outcome, do they break out in terms of what type of approaches are most effective depending on their age group?
Yes. Generally speaking, alienation is easier to reverse in younger children as compared to older ones. Adolescents tend to get entrenched. These attitudes tend to get crystallized. They get all tied up with the normal developmental issues of adolescence involving assertion of autonomy and so forth. And it can be really hard to undo severe alienation in adolescence as compared to younger kids.
Are the treatment interventions been adjusted?
The interventions are adjusted more on the basis of the severity of the phenomena than on the age. Other questions? Yes?
Would you want to speculate on the utility of having parental alienation as a DSM diagnosis?
Utility for whom? I mean,
Generally.
right. If parental alienation were accepted in the DSM in a form that was stripped of Gardner's implication that it had anything at all to do with proving whether or not sexual abuse had occurred, then I think it could simplify a lot of family litigation. There are courts in many other countries that routinely take parental alienation into consideration. There are other countries that have actually passed statutes making it illegal to engage in this kind of alienating behavior. The legal systems of those countries have not collapsed because they've taken those steps. And I think the DSM could help our legal system sort through what is currently a pretty confusing situation by bringing some clarity to it. The question was, what happens in some of the other countries where alienation has been made against the law by statute? And the answer is I don't know off the top of my head. It's what, you know, I don't know what remedies those laws provide. Anything else? Thank you.